I'm going to make is that it's really important to understand the meaning of trophic cascades. This is a technical term in ecology, but to me this is the first step in a 21st century conservation anywhere in the world, in the oceans, in freshwater, and on land. Right now, the major cause of extinction is not introduction of exotic species or over-harvesting, but the cause of the death of nature is politics. And what's behind politics is very simple. All the world's great religions have identified this cause as the major cause of all of our problems, and that is desire. Extreme desire is called greed. Another point I'm going to make is that there has been a mission creep in the natural resource agencies. And this is a phenomenon that we have ignored, but the mission of our natural resources agencies, state and federal, has completely changed in the last 30 years. And I have a confession to make about this, and it's what I call, my way of saying is I've been deluded for 30 years or so about the value of federal lands, federal public lands. It's been like I've been in a trance, is the way I put it. Another point is the conservation movement is still losing political support. The pendulum's still swinging away from us. But we have a vision, I have a vision anyway, that can turn all this around, which I call the Great American Corridor. Which is a term I got or I stole from Florian Schultz. We were in a conversation at the Murray Center about 5 or 10 years ago. I don't know how long it was. And we were talking about Y to Y and the Spine of the Continent initiative. And I said, we were looking for a better name than Spine of the Continent because some people think it's too anatomical sounding. And so he said, what about the Great American Corridor? Another point I'm going to make, and I'm almost done with the introduction, with the summary, is that science is on our side. If science were to make the decision about how to protect nature, we wouldn't have a problem. But science doesn't have any power, really. So even though I'm not an optimist, I still think we can succeed, assuming we work together. Finally, I always assumed that once I got to the age of 75 or so, that I could say anything I damn please. Because people would think I'm senile anyway. And I might fudge a bit. I'll be 75 in 2 months. So hope you don't mind. I'm going to skip the slides for a while, and because I hate PowerPoint, and I haven't used PowerPoint in a talk for about 3 years, but I decided I would give up on this one, but maybe I didn't need to. Anyway, to begin with, what should a conservationist do? The first point is much has been accomplished. We have many good laws, and Congress has done a lot of good by passing these good laws over the last 20 or 30 years. The trouble is they're not always funded or enforced. Why? Politics. But even so, many areas have been protected from devastation and the wounds that we've created. But many of these wounds have been temporarily mitigated or stayed. So the conservation community and the agencies have done a great job, given the political environment we're in, to slow extinction down, to slow the degradation down, but certainly not stop it. And the rate of destruction is increasing. So nonprofit conservation organizations are doing much effective and heroic good work. Some employees of governmental agencies have bravely fought against pressures from above and have helped to slow the staunching. And I thank you. At the same time, as I've said, many public lands, including wilderness areas, are unraveling ecologically from isolation, fragmentation, that is, and from the abuses of recreation. And not nearly enough private lands are being sensitively managed for the well-being of nature and wildness. But this is a symptom of a larger systemic issue. Protecting nature is difficult, and it's more complex and more challenging than, or at least as complex and as challenging as many other wicked problems, like population growth and economic growth, hydraulic fracturing, and climate disruption. So we're just one problem out of many. And I will also point out as I go along that one of the major causes of the extinction crisis, one of the top four, which nobody seems to know about, in part because the ecological community itself has been divided, sort of the old versus the young, and because it's a little difficult to understand. But one of the top four causes of extinction globally are the absence of top-down regulation of ecosystems, the decapitation of ecosystems, the disappearance of apex or top predators. In fact, 90% of them are gone in the world. That includes in fresh waters, where it's more than that, in the oceans and on land. The United States is a good example. Most of our top predators are not here. Where are the wolves and the grizzly bears? In Utah or in Colorado. Let me give you an example. On the East Coast, something mysterious started happening several years ago. One of the most stable fisheries on the East Coast was the scallop fishery. We all like scallops. But they began to disappear, and they virtually disappeared from bays like Chesapeake and all the other large estuaries and bays, or almost all of them, on the East Coast. For a while, it was very mysterious. Nobody could figure out why they were gone, but then people realized, well, their predators, one of their main predators, the cow-nosed ray, had exploded in numbers over that period of time. And they were just gobbling up all of them. Now, the question is, of course, well, why was there suddenly a population explosion of these rays that go around scooping up the scallops from the bottom of the bays? And it took a while to figure that out, but somebody finally put two and two together and said, well, they have a predator too, and their predator has virtually disappeared. Their predator was the large sharks. And why have the great sharks disappeared from the Atlantic coast and almost all the other oceans in the world? They have a predator too. Yeah, people, fishermen. Because of shark fin soup is considered a delicacy. I'm proud to say I've never had it. I have eaten dog, though, in China. So what happens to the sharks after they catch them and they cut off the fins? Well, it's okay because they throw them back and they're still alive. But they can't swim, really, so they die. So that's an example of a trophic cascade, where you remove the strongly interactive species from the ecosystem, which is usually a predator, but not always. Not all strongly interactive species are predators. Aspen trees are strongly interactive species, for example. They're disappearing too for similar reasons, related reasons. Anyway, increasing numbers of marine ecologists and general ecologists now recognize the vital role that predators play in regulating ecosystems. They're the police of ecosystems. And if you remove police from a community, shit happens. The issue of mission drift is one I'd like to mention next, because it relates to my point. On land, our job is more difficult because many government agencies have quietly shifted their mission. I don't think this is a conspiracy. I think this has been almost unconscious evolution, sociological evolution in the bureaucracies. What was the mission 20, 30 years ago of fisheries departments or fisheries biologists or of foresters, of all natural resource managers? The mission was protecting the resource. Have any of you ever heard that phrase, protecting the resource? That was what was drilled into natural resource students. I don't know when it stopped, but it stopped. And that term isn't hardly ever used anymore. And this meant protecting biodiversity, protecting forests, wildlife, fish stocks, healthy wetlands, and rivers. It was a true conservation mission. This used to be the mantra. But now the mission has quietly drifted to protecting something else. That's economic interests. Nowadays, though we never hear high-level agency bureaucrats utter the phrase protecting the resource, they're still in the job of protecting as much as they can, and they do often the best they can. But now their job seems to be facilitating exploitation by income-producing industries such as gas and oil, logging in some places, the beef industry, and also accommodating different kinds of recreation, including the use of off-road mechanical and motorized vehicles, not to mention skiing and climbing and mountain biking and sport hunting, which I do. Other challenges we have in the West include a rapidly growing population and the increasing availability, as I mentioned, of high technology gear, including ATVs, but also hunting has become a high-tech sport, and it's really much easier to hunt now because you don't have to hardly get off of your ATV, and you don't have to hear or see very well because there's all of these aids that are supplied by Cabela's to make it really easy to kill something. Wallace Stegner rebuked the Forest Service 30 years ago. The situation is worse today because, as I said, of increasing population and affluence and the political influence of the extraction lobbies. But he said in his introduction to the Wilderness Letter that he wrote 20 years after the Wilderness Letter, the Forest Service in particular has shown by its reluctance and foot dragging that often puts resource use above preservation. Its proposed wilderness areas have consistently been minimal. Federal bureaus are imperfect human institutions and have sins to answer for and are not being influenced and are not above being influenced by powerful interests. Today, this might seem like a mild rebuke. What must we do? Well, we have some advantages. Those of us who care about nature have some advantages. First, we don't give up, no matter how bad it gets. Why don't we give up? because lovers don't abandon what they love. Another advantage is that we have a vision. We have a compelling, life-affirming, and compassionate vision. And part of this vision is that we envision an extensively connected and secure system of wild areas. I know what you're thinking. This doesn't sound new. It's not new. but in a little while, I'll make... no, I did that already. Anyway, the point was that I was deluded. And my thinking was in the box. And it's only been in the last few months that I finally woke up and said to myself, you know, we've been struggling for a decade or more to protect, say, the spine of the continent in the United States. To allow wolves to come back, for example. They're the consummate keystone species, the consummate actor, strong interactor in our systems. And we've been struggling to create a network of protected areas and link them up with corridors, wildlife corridors. And we haven't gotten very far because we've been focused on public lands. And we're just not going to win in the foreseeable future because of the politics and because of the energy crisis. Drill, baby, drill. But we still have a strong suit, and that is, as I mentioned, science. We now have the science to prove our case about the important role that predators play and other keystone species play, to at least to a rational and unbiased audience. This has happened, I mean, the same thing's been going on in the climate modeling, climate change world. Brilliant climatologists like James Hansen and the recently deceased Steve Schneider, and the work of dozens of other climate scientists around the globe, have withstanding the well-funded attacks of the climate change deniers. And the persistence of these scientists has, like Hansen and Schneider, has convinced most objective people about the impending crises of sea level rise, water wars, violent weather events and droughts, and agricultural debacles, and food shortages, and the inevitable inflationary spirals that are starting to occur right now in food, for example, that are coming. So, you know, in academia and among intelligent lay people, science has won the battle. Of course, not in Congress, though. The problem is that there aren't many unbiased, objective people. But the same thing is true for convincing people that if we keep going and allow all the top predators in the seas and on land and in the fresh waters to disappear, then all we can do is stand back and watch the dissolution, watch the disappearance of more and more species. Because once you decapitate ecosystems, they will unravel. They will degrade, no matter what you do. So the evidence is now overwhelming that there will be this massive unraveling of ecosystems, a crash in diversity and resilience, particularly where ecosystems have lost their keystone species, their strong actors. By the way, a keystone species, the term comes from the old arches that had, you know, the keystone at the top, shaped like this, the last stone to be inserted, that holds the arch up. You take those out, the whole arch collapses. And the metaphor is applied to ecology, because there are some species like that. They're not all predators by any means. Prairie dogs, kangaroo rats, ants and termites in some ecosystems are just as important or more important than the large predators. We don't have huge termite mounds like they do in Australia here. We do have wolves and lots of others. Let me give you another example. Some colleagues at Berkeley, in Justin Brashear's lab, and he himself worked in Ghana for a number of years, looking at the national parks in Ghana and what's going on there. And they studied 6 of them, but 3 of them, which were the smaller ones, over time, because of persecution, have lost They're lions, they're leopards, they're spotted hyenas, and they're wild dogs. The four big top predators in those systems. And they've really dropped off. And as they've disappeared because of harassment by people and hunting, another species has taken their place, in a sense, olive baboons. Now, baboons are really smart, and it took 3 years for the baboon populations to start to grow along this logarithmic trajectory. But as the large predators decline to 10%, the baboons have increased by 365% in some of these parks. And baboons are very efficient hunters, and they switched from being primarily vegetarian to primarily carnivorous. And they're very organized the way they hunt. And one of the ways they hunt is they form a militaristic line, a long line that marches, and they march across the savannas with their arms outstretched, fingers just about touching. And they go along and they scare up everything in the savannah that's alive, whether it's monkeys or large rodents or large antelopes or small antelopes, and they kill them and eat them. So the fauna of all these parks is basically disappearing. And it started with the disappearance of the large carnivores, the apex predators. And that's happening all over the world. And it's happened in Yellowstone. You know the Yellowstone story. I probably don't have to repeat it. So, where was I? The baboon story. It's like having a stroke. When an ecosystem loses its large predators, it loses a lot of its functionality, because large predators are the policemen. They regulate the whole system from the top down. I know it isn't politically correct to talk about top-down regulation, but that's the way nature works in most places. And so when you take off the top, which is like having a stroke in a human, you lose a lot of function. And it doesn't come back very much, usually. So even though we're right and we're virtuous people, that doesn't win a lot of friends. The political pendulum is still accelerating away from us, in part because of our depressing message, which I personify. But also because our work doesn't increase ordinary citizens' tangible assets or help them pay for the inflated price of gasoline. So unlike the enemies, we're barred from appealing to people's greed. And since we're the messenger of bad news, you know what happens to the messenger. It's a dilemma. So how can we realize our vision of a broadly and densely connected network of secure semi-wild areas, which is what we need? It's the only thing that will save most of biodiversity in North America or anywhere else. A secure, broadly and densely connected network. So what is the compelling dream that will awaken the public? Bring them over, that will inspire the nation, that will appeal to its values of freedom and destiny. And like John Kennedy, motivate a mass movement. In that case, in Kennedy's course, it was to get people to the moon. In our case, is to save the earth. So that's why I nominated the Great American Corridor, which Yellowstone and Yukon is part of. It's a major component of it. But I'm just talking really about the part in the United States, from Canada to Mexico, and possibly a little bit across the borders, depending on our friends to the north and south. What's the purpose of a continental scale Great American Corridor? I'll mention the scientific reasons in a minute, but why is the project worth considering? Because it helps recreate a sense of freedom and space and adventure that we're missing. We're missing in this country, and many recreational possibilities, similar to those existing along the Appalachian Trail, the Continental Divide Trail, and the Pacific Crest. It addresses the administration's other national priority, clearly enunciated in the Great American Corridors Initiative, including outdoor recreation and outdoor education and more hunting and fishing opportunities, shaking off extra pounds by walking and climbing, running. And someday, I hope people will ask, have you hiked? Have you hiked in the Great American Corridor yet? So what this does, coming back to a word we've heard a lot today, is create connectivity or connection. I think connection is a better word. Because without continuous habitat, or ecosystems, all the way from Mexico to Canadian border and beyond, our ecosystems will continue to unravel. That's because there's no protection without connection. Without connection, species won't be able to move, individuals won't be able to move in response to climate change. And we all know about that, and you've heard about that today. Without connection, a lot of other problems will occur. This makes sense politically, I think, because the idea of it's inspiring to me, anyway, of a Great American Corridor. And I think it could be made to be attractive, and it could actually be shown to produce net gains economically in those regions that have it going through. So it must make sense politically, but first we need to get real about the West. This will be the hardest pill to swallow. This idea that we've been in a trance, we've been hypnotized by the huge areas in the West that are called public lands. We've been hypnotized by what we thought was their potential for conservation. I always assumed that we were blessed in the West because nearly half of the land in Utah, 60%, is in the public trust, the public estate. This land is our land. Is it really? I now believe that except for a few national parks, our optimism about the potential for conservation of biological diversity for nature protection in the public lands has been misplaced or stupid. No, we never tested the hypothesis. If we were scientists, if I had been a scientist thinking about this when I became a conservationist and stopped being a scientist, I would have said, well, have we tested the hypothesis that public lands are the place that we should be working? And we never did. And now we're getting the results, because the public lands are really managed by politicians who have other interests. So even though we're extraordinarily fortunate, and I feel very fortunate in being part of the West and living in Colorado, or like you in Utah, or other people like Wyoming or Nevada or Montana or Idaho or New Mexico or Arizona, it's easy to be deluded, because when we go outside and gaze out past the Walmart and Home Depot parking lots, at the red mesas, at the blue mountains, at the wide expanses of polychrome deserts and prairies, it's easy to believe that, oh, we can save nature out there. We can get all our wildlife back in those places. I mean, there's so much beauty and grandeur, it's true. It's enough to make us rub our hands and say, oh boy, look at all that space out there. Or as Wallace Stegner wrote, we are surrounded by a geography of hope. But was it, and is it? And is it prudent to remain entranced by this dream? I don't think so. There is stunning scenery, there are grand vistas and magnificent mountains, but do we have a chance to save nature there? A good naturalist always asks the following question: what is missing? What's missing from this picture? What's missing from this landscape? So let's begin by asking, where are the most interactive species? Where are the grizzlies? Where are the wolverines? Where's the quintessential keystone species in the northern hemisphere, the wolf? Where are the badgers? Where are the burrowing owls? Where are the boreal toads? Where's the bison? Where are the lynx? Where are the pike minnows and the cutthroat trout? And why are the beaver populations so fragmented? And where are the prairie dogs going? Prairie dogs, after all, are the major nutritional resource for eagles and hawks and badgers and coyotes. And they are the engineers of very generous burrow systems that provide cover and solace for many other species. They're keystone species too. The point is, not all species are equal. There are some species that are more equal than others. And we call these top-down regulators the enforcers, because they control two things. They keep the ungulates from exploding as the white-tailed deer and now mule deer and elk are exploding throughout the country in the West. And they also control the mesopredators, which depending on where you are. Some places the mesopredators are coyotes, some places they're foxes, some places, and they're always raccoons and house cats. I got into a lot of trouble. I was interviewed by the Nature Conservancy for the first and last time about 30 years ago, and I was interviewed about what cats were doing to birds in the canyons of San Diego, native birds. And I told the truth there, a big mistake. They never had any article that got more pissed off letters from their readers than that interview. So I've never been asked for another interview. So the problem is we can delude ourselves by thinking that the disappearances of all these keystone species from public lands is transient, that it'll be reversed. This is what certain economic interests want us to believe, but if they thought about it. But I think this belief that the missing species will be allowed to return, like wolves, and that backcountry management will soon be fixed is the great lie of the West. It's the lie to ourselves. Nobody is telling us this. We just sort of assume that eventually things will turn around in public lands, in BLM and Forest Service lands. I think a harbinger of things to come is the senescence and failure to reproduce of cottonwoods and aspens in the West. Everywhere you look in the West, cottonwoods are not reproducing, recruiting, as the botanists say, and aspen are dying. And part of it, it's complex. Everything in ecology is complex and has more than one cause. I have 3 rules of ecology I was going to read to you. Rule 1, context is everything in ecology and in society. Everything is scale dependent. It depends on what scale you look at things. You've heard that today. And changes, here's a third one, changes in nature always have multiple causes. Human beings always tend to look for the one cause, the one, what's it called, the smoking gun. Thank you very much. But in nature, it's not the way it works. There's always multiple causes, and the disappearance of these species and the destruction of our ecosystems also has multiple causes. So do for example, sudden aspen decline in the West. It has multiple causes too. Drought and beetles and fungus and elk, who bark the trees in the winter to get the cambium. It's a major source of nutrition for them in the winter. But that allows the spores of the fungus to invade, and that contributes. So although foresters don't like to admit it, overpopulation of elk is one of the causes of aspen, sudden aspen decline, I believe. Of course, in lots of places, it's cattle grazing that's stopping the recruitment of cottonwoods, especially in the lower elevation valleys. So bluntly speaking, our missing keystone or caretaker species and processes will not be restored to ecological effectiveness on public lands in my lifetime, and probably not in yours, to levels that are more than symbolic. So public lands are no country for old species. There are some things that are making it. They're doing very well. Deer and elk are doing very well in the West. They're super plentiful. And Aldo Leopold recognized this and began to document it. And his poignant summary of the situation was this: I now suspect that just as the deer herd lives in mortal fear of its wolves, so does the mountain live in mortal fear of its deer. Perhaps he wrote, this is the hidden meaning of the wolf, long known among the mountains, but seldom perceived among men. He was so articulate. So Leopold understood why deer and elk erupted in much of the West and all the Midwest and East. It's simple. It was policy, public lands policy, for decades, and still is, to get rid of the top predators because they were competing for deer and elk. And that really hasn't changed a lot in 60 years. There's another reason. State wildlife agencies fund themselves by selling the right to harvest deer and elk, hunting licenses, and they benefit from their abundance. They pay their salaries. Unfortunately, our fish and game agencies, our wildlife agencies, are not funded out of the general funds from states. They're funded from hunting licenses and fishing licenses, which is a serious problem. So in addition, agency managers are often paralyzed or immobilized by what I call the values polarization in the West, the culture wars, the competing ideologies in the West. These culture wars are proving to be a struggle of NFL proportions, whatever set of values, whether conservative or liberal, you espouse. So I'm saying let's not hold our breath waiting for middle and top-level managers from the BLM and the Forest Service to say, oh, we've been wrong, we must protect trophy cascades and predator-driven top-down forcing. We'll never hear those words. I also wonder if Wallace Stegner's geography of hope has morphed into a biogeography of despair, at least on public lands. And I can't truly believe that any Congress or administration in the foreseeable future will have the interest or courage to truly reform the Forest Service and the BLM, or that Western states will reconstruct their resource agencies into real conservation agencies. Stegner liked to demolish myths, particularly pernicious myths. And this is almost a quote from an article in the current issue of High Country News written by Michelle Nijhuis, who was reviewing a book by Stegner, re-reviewing a book by Stegner. So what I'm doing right now is I'm looking for a 12-step group for those addicted to failed myths. Because we have a failed myth. So as part of this confession of blind optimism in the past, let me show you some examples of irrational exuberance. Could I have the overhead, not the overhead, slides? You can tell I'm from another generation. The PowerPoint. Oh, okay. How do I forward? Okay, thank you. I like quotes. This is one of my favorite. and cartoons. Thus, when the film is run... Okay. I spoke about Yellowstone. This is what Yellowstone looked like before the wolves came back. Notice no young cottonwood trees in this picture. And look at the elk are lying down in the middle of the day in a flat area. If there were wolves there, they wouldn't be doing that, would they? And this is the same thing up the hill in an aspen grove. This is more recent. Before the wolves came back, no recruitment of aspen, no regeneration of aspen until the wolves came back. Now, this isn't true all over Yellowstone. I'm well aware of Matt Kaufman's paper. And there are lots of reasons why researchers get different results, but I believe that wolves are really helping the recovery of Yellowstone. So where was I? Okay, slides. Yes, slides. All right. I'm a morning person. I'm sorry. Okay, I was talking about a big mistake we made. This is a slide that we often show about top-down regulation. Two paths of trophic cascades where large carnivores control the consumers, which is deer and elk, and large carnivores control the mesopredators, like house cats and possums and raccoons and skunks and foxes and coyotes in some places. And those mesopredators, if they become abundant, they cause the release of the small prey. I mean, if they become abundant, they destroy the small prey and they destroy the vegetation. That's a bird. I just wanted to show a bird. That's another one. That's one of the cutest birds. And why are they're disappearing in the West? Why are they disappearing in the West? Partly because of elimination of prairie dogs. Because they rely on prairie dog burrows and other burrows. So it's another example of a trophic cascade. I'm sorry, Harvey. Okay, here's a little confession. Part of the confession is when you look at, this is the spine of the continent, part of the spine of the continent, and when you look at this area, there's all the blue and all the green are public lands. The green is protected areas. The rest is regular Forest Service and BLM lands. So you say, oh boy, look at all that public land. We must be able to protect nature on that public land. But if you change the scale, if you look at a finer scale, as Jody was saying, then you begin to see another story. And you see that there's a lot of white begins to show up. And this is the area where I live, around Paoni and Hotchkiss, across the state line over that way. And at this scale, you see a whole lot of white, and which are obstacles to repatriation of large carnivores and other animals, to obstacles to movement, fragmentation of the habitat. So when you look at public lands, you can be mistaken for a number of reasons. Depending on what scale you look at, you can imagine that it's being managed responsibly to protect nature, and you can think that it's not fragmented. But neither of those are true. And the mistake we made when we did the Wildlands network design for the Southern Rockies, which is a little bit east of here, including Wyoming, parts of Wyoming, the Rocky Mountains in Wyoming and Colorado, and in northern New Mexico, was that all this blue area, and maybe, I don't need to point it, but you can see all that blue area and all the green area was identified by Carlos Carroll and others and ourselves as really good wolf habitat. And the definition of wolf habitat is where there's elk. And we call this kind of map the meat map. Because if there's lots of elk, there's going to be lots of wolves. But there aren't lots of wolves. This was done 5 or 6 years ago, and nothing's changed. Wolves are coming into Colorado. Wolves are coming in, but they get shot and poisoned just about as fast as they come in. And that's on public land, because there's really no policing of public lands. And once in a while an arrest is made, but it's very rare that a wolf is killed and there's any charges brought. And when charges are brought, they're usually dismissed. So I'm going to talk about one of the solutions. We need a system that will connect up. We need a corridor that will connect up much of the West. It can't rely completely on public lands. It's got to rely on other kinds of lands. But let me go back and say, first of all, one solution is what I call nature's aspirin. Aspirin is a miracle drug. It's an analgesic, a painkiller. It's an antipyretic. It controls inflammation. It's an anticoagulant used to treat many diseases, including heart disease. It's a prophylaxis against a heart attack. As soon as you get a heart attack, if you take some aspirin, you're likely to survive, have a higher probability of surviving. And in every year or two, a new function of aspirin is discovered. 2 years ago, it was that it helps prevent colon cancer, which is great for us geezers. So aspirin's a miracle drug. What we need is a miracle drug for nature. What is nature's aspirin? Connection, connectivity. So what does connectivity do? It supports the dispersal and return of keystone species, like wolves. It allows the range shifts during climate change. This is a major issue now, because if we continue to fragment the West, including the Rocky Mountain regions, species won't be able to move north or northwest or wherever they need to move, and they'll go extinct. It would be too costly to put them on freight trains and ship them. And thirdly, nature's aspirin, or connectivity, mitigates against isolation caused by habitat disruption. Connectivity is not, as we heard today at one point, open space or green belts. Green belts are usually, thank you, are usually death traps, are usually ecological sinks, because there's kids, and there's dogs, and there's cats, and there's golf balls, and other things that are not helpful. There's also pesticides and herbicides in green belts. So just because an area is green doesn't mean it's good for nature. The same goes for utility corridors, which are mowed and herbicided, and urban parks. So these are not good places to you can't assume that that's connectivity. So, but we have the opportunity. We haven't had the resources, and we've been barking up the wrong tree with public lands, but we have the opportunity to create something very exciting, a great American corridor. And let's skip that. I'm going to mention 4 elements that are needed to make something like this happen in the United States. There are actually probably 40 elements that are needed, but here are 4. This is a picture of John Davis. Some of you used to read Wild Earth magazine, I know. And John Davis was the first editor of Wild Earth. John Davis is a real outdoorsman. He's a woodsman. He's very strong. And he's volunteered to take a trek. We call it Trek East in the Wildlands Network. He's walking or canoeing or bicycling or skiing all the way from Key Largo in Florida up to the Maritime Provinces in Canada. throughout the Eastern Wildway. And this is his route. The white dotted line is his route, staying on lands that are not highly developed, as much as possible, from Florida to Canada. And it's going to take him. He started about 3 weeks ago, and he's got a blog. If you can go to wildlandsnetwork.org and find Trek East and find his blog, and it's very exciting. And he's taking notes, and all the way along, he's marketing the idea of connections. He's marketing the idea that we can save nature in North America. And he's being interviewed by hundreds of people. It's in newspapers and on radios and television. Along the way, he's having remarkable success, Wildlands is, in getting the word out. So what he's doing, he's popularizing the idea of continental scale connections, continental scale conservation. Here's the start of the trip, and he's above Tampa now, and he's headed up towards Gainesville. Here's the web page from Wildlands Network, Trek East, that you can find. It's very exciting. But for us here, it's even more exciting that he's coming west. When he finishes Trek East, he's going to do Trek West, the same kind of walk and hike and bicycle and canoe and skiing from the Canadian border to the Mexican border, or vice versa. So this sort of thing, it is attracting a lot of attention, a wide audience, and it's the kind of outreach that we've lacked in the spine of the continent. So we're really excited, and it seems to be working. Something else that seems to be working is another element, what we call wild lifelines. We're working with a modeler from Colorado State University, Dave Theobald, on producing a way of modeling a national scale corridor, or many national scale corridors, which is what the blue lines are. The blue lines are the most natural, or habitat where there's the most natural, sorry, getting my words mixed up, the places where there's the most natural habitat for movement, for long-range movements. This is a complex model, and I don't have time to go into it. But the point of this is, to me, it's compelling because it actually shows that it would be possible to create one long corridor from Canada to Mexico where people and animals could move and plants could move as a result of climate change. One of the reasons this hasn't happened is because the idea hasn't seemed real or feasible to people. So here's a starting point, and this is just a starting point. It's just the first step in creating a science-based corridor, science-based route for creatures to move north and south over an entire continent. So it is possible. And to me, this is very inspiring that we've gotten this far. So we can actually begin to envisage the Great American Corridor. The third element I want to look at is private lands and community outreach. Wildlands Network is helping to organize networks of willing, volunteer, entrepreneurial landowners in the West. Many of which are already restoring and reconnecting and rewilding their lands. We're having a meeting co-sponsored by the Wilberforce Foundation and the High Lonesome Ranch in Colorado in July that will bring together many of the largest landowners in the West, all of which already have conservation lands, have conservation ranches, and most of which are predator friendly. That is, they don't kill large predators. And the goal is within 5 years to have 5 million acres of lands committed to this campaign, this initiative to create lots of land in the West that will be predator friendly. And that's as big as Yellowstone. So, and that's just the beginning. And sometime this fall, the Biophilia Foundation and Wildlands are sponsoring another meeting of landowners somewhere in Arizona, I think it's in New Mexico, to do the same thing. And there are other initiatives like this. But this idea is catching on. The whole point is we can't depend only on at least public lands. And actually, things may be a lot more secure. There may be a much higher chance of breeding of wolves, for example, on the High Lonesome Ranch than there are in any of the BLM or Forest Service lands around them, because access is controlled. And because the managers really want to do this, and they have the resources to do it in some cases. Paul Valdick is one of the main owners of this ranch. But we see sudden aspen decline here, and we think one of the reasons is there are too many elk, besides drought. Here's an exclosure where we're testing this hypothesis scientifically by keeping elk out of these areas so recruitment can happen and so barking isn't as intensive on the trees, to see if that stops this decline of the aspen. So the other point I was going to make is green jobs, and I don't have any time left, but I just wanted to point out that here's some people who are working on these projects. This happened to be a meeting of the Society for Ecological Restoration with Wildlands Network to plan another big meeting in Mexico in this coming August or September, I think. A big part of this is restoration, is jobs. Lots of people, lots of organizations in the conservation movement and the agencies are interested in creating green jobs and helping to restore and reconnect and rewild the West by restoration, ecological restoration, as a stream restoration shows along that bank over there. Right now, unfortunately, there's no money. And all the talk in the world about how we need more, something like the CCC again, isn't going to make it happen. But you have to be patient. There's always windows of opportunities, and good times will return, I hope. And so funding for green jobs may happen soon. So in conclusion, along with all the Leopold and Wallace Stegner, let's not give up on the geography of hope, and let's be creative in its achievement in the West. Thank you very much.